I always had control. From a young age, I was taught to see beyond what was in front of me, to seize opportunities that others couldn't see. I built an empire, a fortune that placed me among the most respected names in the financial sector. At 35, I was already a millionaire, surrounded by luxuries that few even dream of having. I flew from one side of the world to the other, solving problems, closing million-dollar deals, always surrounded by a restricted circle of executives and investors who depended on my decisions. Everything was under my command. That morning started like so many others, waking up in a five-star hotel bed with a panoramic view of the city below me. A brief call with my assistants to check the status of the companies I managed, while drinking my coffee from fine china as if it were something commonplace. For me, it was. Everything I touched seemed to turn into gold. Quick decisions, relentless precision. My private jet was already waiting for me, and in a few hours I would be on another continent, ready for another business deal. But what I didn't know was that on that flight, destiny was about to play me the biggest trick of my life. Inside the plane, I was reviewing contracts on my laptop, my mind focused on the next big project. There was no room for distractions. The luxurious silence of the cabin, the low sound of the engines. It was just another day at work, another trip. Then slight turbulence shook the jet. I didn't pay much attention. This happened all the time, but soon after, a strange sound began to come from the turbine. I looked around. The crew's faces were tense. Something was wrong. Before I could process what was happening, the plane began to fall. The fall was dizzying. The controller, which had always been in my hands, was slipping through my fingers. I felt my body being thrown against the seatbelt. Panic took over me, a feeling I wasn't used to feeling. I was used to having answers, to having solutions, but at that moment, everything seemed out of my reach. The noise of the fuselage breaking apart and the muffled screams of the other passengers mixed with the deafening sound of the wind. My world was falling apart along with the plane. I tried desperately to hold on to anything, but the impact was inevitable. Darkness took over. When I regained consciousness, the first thing I felt was pain. A sharp pain ran through my body, but the confusion was greater. Everything was silent. My mind was desperately trying to understand where I was. The smell of fuel mixed with salty seawater was suffocating. With effort, I managed to sit up. The scene around me was like a nightmare, debris scattered everywhere, pieces of the plane floating in the calm waters, and an island, deserted and distant, like a ghost on the horizon. I got up, staggering. The sun hit my face, obscuring my vision. There was no sign of other survivors, just the vastness of the ocean and that inhospitable island in front of me. What was left of my private jet was in pieces, and with it, the world I knew. Reality hit me like a punch in the stomach. I, who used to command meeting rooms, negotiate millions with a simple signature, was now alone on an island, without resources, with no one to help me. My expensive clothes were soaked and torn, my body was bruised and exhausted, and my mind, always sharp, was beginning to weaken under the enormity of the situation. I looked at the horizon, hoping, under the illusion that, at any moment, a rescue team would come and get me. After all, that's what I did. I solved problems. But as the hours passed, reality became clearer. Nobody knew where I was. No helicopters were flying overhead. No signs of life were approaching. I was completely alone. I started walking, feeling the warm sand beneath my feet. The heat was oppressive, and thirst was beginning to take over me. My thoughts ran in an endless loop. How could this happen? How do I get out of here? The millionaire who controlled everything, who lived in an ivory tower surrounded by privilege, was now at the mercy of a deserted island, with nothing but my will to survive. The luxury, the comfort, the privileges that I had always taken for granted were now useless. Everything I had accumulated throughout my life meant nothing there. My fortune, my status, none of that could save me now. The only thing that mattered was my ability to resist and somehow survive this. When night fell, the darkness brought with it an even scarier reality. The island, which already seemed hostile in the sunlight, became a place of shadows and unfamiliar sounds. The wind blew strongly through the trees, making the leaves dance, and the constant noise of the waves crashing on the rocks mixed with noises that I couldn't identify. I was alone, more alone than I ever imagined possible. And that thought hit me like an unexpected blow deep in the chest. I, who was always surrounded by people, assistants, business partners, security guards, now there was no one. No one to tell me what to do, no one to share this suffocating anguish. It was just me and the deathly silence of the island. My mind, which had once prided itself on solving complex problems, was now paralyzed. I spent hours looking at the horizon, as if the answer to my situation would magically appear out of the sea. Fear began to seep into my veins like a slow poison, and reality became an invisible prison. I knew I couldn't just stand there, that I needed to do something, but I couldn't move. Every inch of my body screamed in pain. I was bruised, exhausted, dehydrated. And yet, the worst pain was mental. I saw myself as a child lost in a nightmare. But this time, there was no waking up. When the sun rose, I forced myself to get up. I needed to find water. I remembered some documentaries I saw and casual conversations about survival, but I never thought I would need that information. I always thought these things happened to other people, in other contexts. Now he was there, his mouth dry, his lips chapped, and his body consumed by thirst. I began walking around the island, each step more difficult than the last, looking for any sign of fresh water. The walk was exhausting. Each movement seemed to steal a little more of my strength. The hot sand burned my feet, the thorny plants hurt my legs, and the scorching sun seemed to suck what little energy I had left. My mind started playing tricks. I heard voices as if someone was calling me, but there was no one. Every shadow seemed like a figure, every noise a sign of rescue. But it was just my mind, desperate, trying to find a way out of the terror I found myself in. After hours of wandering, I finally found a small stream. The water ran slowly, but it was enough. I threw myself on the floor, drinking greedily, not caring about the dirt or the taste. The relief was immediate, but it didn't last long. The cold of reality returned soon after. That water wasn't enough to keep me alive for long. I needed to find shelter, food, and a way to protect myself, not just from nature, but from myself. Despair began to take over. Every time I tried to think of a solution, my mind closed down. I was completely out of my comfort zone, far from the luxury and ease with which I had always lived. For the first time, I realized how fragile my existence was. All the money, all the power I accumulated over the years, none of it made a difference there. The island didn't care who I was, how much money I had. I was just another body trying to survive. The hours dragged on, and with them, hunger became an implacable enemy. My stomach hurt like never before. I thought about how, just 2 days ago, I was in an expensive restaurant complaining about the doneness of the meat. Now I would give anything for any piece of food, for something that would alleviate that sharp pain that was gnawing at me inside. I tried hunting, I tried fishing. My inexperience was a cruel joke. Each attempt felt like a sham, a stark reminder that I didn't know how to survive without modern comforts. All I had was my will to keep going, to not give up. But even that was starting to fail. The biggest challenge, however, was not physical. It was mental. The lonely hours with no one to talk to, without a familiar face, began to consume me. Being alone with my thoughts, without distractions, was torment. Every mistake I made throughout my life, every wrong choice, every missed opportunity came back to me with painful clarity. It was as if the island was more than a physical challenge. It was a psychological ordeal, forcing me to confront everything I had avoided for so many years. The night returned, bringing with it the fears I tried to bury during the day. The sound of the wind in the trees, the rustle of leaves, everything seemed magnified in the silence of the darkness. I looked up at the sky, the stars shining above me, and I wondered if someone somewhere was looking at that same sky, if anyone cared enough to look for me. But the silence of the night was my only answer. I was alone, completely alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was what I feared most. The next day was even crueler. I woke up to the bright sunlight penetrating my eyelids, my skin burned and my muscles stiff. The body, punished by hunger and thirst, was on the verge of exhaustion. My chapped lips and dry throat made every attempt to swallow an act of torture. My mind, which was already beginning to get used to solitude, fought against the idea that perhaps this was the end of me. I, a millionaire who always had everything at my fingertips, was being slowly destroyed by nature. But I refused to accept it. Not now, not anytime soon. I needed to move. I needed to do something, anything that would give me a feeling of control, even if it was minimal. I decided to explore more of the island. Maybe there was a resource I hadn't found yet. With my stomach growling, I dragged myself across the hot sand, my body heavy, trying to ignore my growing dizziness. That's when I saw something that gave me a glimmer of hope. At the top of a rock formation, I noticed a small cave. Maybe it would be a good idea to seek shelter there, at least until the next day. The heat was slowly killing me, and that shade seemed like the only thing that could protect me for a while. The climb was more difficult than I imagined. Every step was a monumental effort. My hands shook as I gripped the rocks, and my feet, already injured and bare, kept slipping. But I continued. The fear of death drove me forward, but at the same time, it was always lurking, like a shadow following me. When I finally reached the top, I entered the cave with a relieved sigh. The place was small and damp, but the feeling of being protected, even for a few moments, brought me a rare relief. I lay down on the cold floor, my body shaking with exhaustion, and I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the pain that throbbed in every part of me. When I woke up, the light was already starting to dim. The afternoon was fading away, and with it, my hopes seemed to fade too. I needed to find something to eat. Anything. It had been days since the accident, and the human body can only take so much. Without the strength to continue walking, I crawled back into the area around the cave. It was then that I found some fruit on a nearby bush. They looked dubious, but desperation no longer allowed me to make rational choices. I plucked the fruits from the bush and greedily began to eat them. The taste was bitter, and something in the back of my mind screamed that this wasn't right, but the survival instinct spoke louder. I needed energy. I needed something in my stomach. But this decision, driven by desperate hunger, almost led to my death. A few hours later, the discomfort began. First, it was a pain in the stomach, small and bearable. But in a matter of minutes, that pain evolved into something much worse. An unbearable heat rose in my chest, followed by a feeling of extreme nausea. I fell to my knees, trying to take a deep breath, but the air wouldn't come. It was as if my body was revolting against me, expelling the poison I had ingested. My muscles began to contract violently, and the dizziness returned with a vengeance. The world around me was spinning, and all I could do was hold on to the ground, as if it could save me. My thoughts were confused, and fear took over every cell in my body. I was dying. That was it. That cave would be my tomb, and no one would ever know. No one would ever find my body. I died of hunger and loneliness. How ironic for someone who has always had the world at her feet. The vision began to darken, strength fading quickly. I fought to keep my eyes open, but it was useless. My body no longer obeyed my mind's commands. Sweat dripped down my forehead, and I felt the life slipping away. The distant sound of the sea seemed to echo further and further away. Each breath seemed to be the last. Everything inside me screamed not to give up, but my body wouldn't listen to me anymore. My hands shook, my legs didn't respond. That could be the last time I would see heaven. And then, a deep silence took over me. My mind wandered between consciousness and total blackout. I don't know how long I lay there, lying on the cold earth, fighting between life and death. The seconds dragged by and I was ready to give up. But, as if in a final act of mercy, my body began to react. The nausea gradually subsided, the heat in my chest eased, and slowly I was able to breathe again. It was as if death had given me a respite, a second chance, perhaps the last. I spent the night in that miserable state, trapped between life and death, wondering if it was worth fighting anymore. When the day finally broke, I was still alive. But that was not victory. My body was devastated, my mind was in shambles, and the hunger, thirst, and pain were still with me. But somehow I survived that night. I survived what felt like my end. The problem was, how much longer could I hold out? I was still alive, but death had left its mark on me. When I woke up, sunlight was weakly coming through the mouth of the cave, and the first thing I felt was pain. My muscles were rigid, and the feeling of hunger was no longer a simple discomfort, but a constant torture that consumed me from the inside out. Every movement hurt, and my head throbbed, the result of the poison that almost killed me the night before. The bitter taste was still in my mouth, and my throat felt like sandpaper. I stood up with difficulty, my knees shaking. The simple act of standing felt like a losing battle. I looked around the cave, that miserable hole that was now my only refuge, and realized how low I had fallen. I, who used to look at the world from above, was now reduced to a hungry, weak, and directionless man. Why was I still fighting? The question echoed in my mind all the time. What kept me going, forcing me to keep breathing, even when every second felt harder than the last? Maybe it was the fear of death. No matter how cruel island life was, the thought of disappearing, of simply ceasing to exist, was a dread I couldn't overcome. That was what pushed me forward, even if each step was more painful than the last. Hunger was a torment. I knew I couldn't risk eating anything else on that island without knowing if it was safe. He was surrounded by exuberant nature, but at the same time it seemed hostile and treacherous. I decided I needed to get out of the cave and try to find something to eat. But every attempt to hunt or fish seemed like a cruel joke. I didn't have the necessary skills to survive in that environment. All he knew was about the business world, about trading stocks and maximizing profits. But here, on the island, all my knowledge was useless. I spent hours trying to catch small fish with my hands, without success. The ocean seemed to mock me, its calm waves hiding the abundance I couldn't reach. Once again, I found myself on my knees in the sand, screaming in frustration. It was a feeling I wasn't used to dealing with. My life had been built on achievements, on success. But now, everything he did resulted in failure. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. The days began to blend together. The notion of time was getting lost in my mind. I no longer knew if it was morning or afternoon. I just saw the light changing around me, like an endless cycle that I couldn't stop. My mind was in decline, and I began to doubt my sanity. Sometimes I heard voices of people I knew, of old business partners, of friends. At first, they were like distant whispers, but as the days passed, they became clearer. I started talking to them as if they were real. "Why are you here?" one of them asked me, the voice of an old mentor. "Shouldn't you be in control?" I tried to ignore it, but my mind was relentless. He knew he was on the verge of losing what little control he had left. The loneliness, the silence, was slowly breaking me. There was no sound of human life, no smiles, no conversations. I was trapped with my thoughts and memories, and they became darker and darker. On one of these nights, a storm arrived. The island, which until then had been relatively peaceful, turned into a chaos of wind and rain. The trees swayed violently, and the seawater rose, advancing over the beach. I ran into the cave, cowering in the corner as thunder boomed in the sky. It was as if the world was screaming at me, reflecting the storm raging inside me. The wind howled, and the rain hit the rocks hard, echoing deep inside the cave. For hours I stood there, watching the chaos outside, feeling so small, so insignificant in the face of nature's fury. For what seemed like an eternity, I felt like the storm was about to finish me off. Water began to slowly enter the cave, a warning that not even my precarious shelter was safe. And then I found myself on the brink of death again, thinking that this could be my last night. I had nowhere to run. The water level was rising, and my body was so exhausted that I couldn't even stand up. Every thunder boom in the sky made me shudder, and fear grew more and more inside me. Maybe it would be better to accept it. Maybe it would be better to let the sea take me. After all, what else did I have to lose? The isolation, the hunger, the thirst, the pain. Everything seemed to be piling up into an inevitable sentence. I closed my eyes, waiting for the water to rise higher, for the storm to finally swallow me. But again, fate decided to spare me. When I opened my eyes, the water level had stabilized, and the storm began to dissipate. The wind, which before seemed to want to rip the trees from the ground, now blew calmer, and the rain reduced to a fine drizzle. Once again, death had passed me by, leaving only its shadow. I was alive. But the question was, until when? The dim light of the next morning illuminated the cave, revealing a man broken, both physically and mentally. I was in pieces. I survived another night, but the weight of everything that was happening was beginning to crush me. And the worst thing was that, even after so many days, no one came. There were no signs of rescue. There were no ships on the horizon. There was not even a chance of salvation. How much longer could I hold out before finally giving up? Dawn arrived, but I no longer felt the same. The storm that almost killed me the night before seemed to have taken part of me away. He was weaker, both in body and mind. My body, once strong and resilient, was now just a pile of skin, muscles shrunken from lack of food and water. The skin, previously tanned from so many trips to the most luxurious places in the world, was now pale and full of wounds. But nothing compared to what was happening inside me. I felt like I was on the verge of losing my mind, and that terrified me more than hunger or isolation. The days passed slowly, and the line between reality and illusion began to blur. Sometimes I saw things. I would look at the horizon, and for a brief moment I would see what looked like a ship or a plane in the sky. But as soon as he blinked, they disappeared, leaving only emptiness. It was as if the island was playing with my mind, showing me glimmers of hope only to take them away soon after. The voices in my head got louder. I started talking to them. Yes, talking to the wind, to the stones, to my own shadow. Memories of meetings, parties, conversations with people who were thousands of kilometers away. I knew I was losing control, but I couldn't stop. I felt like I was in an endless nightmare, trapped in a distorted reality with no way out. My sanity was hanging by a thread. Loneliness was an unbearable weight. I was forced to confront everything I had always avoided. In the past, when I felt down, all it took was a call to a friend, a business partner, or even a trip to somewhere exotic. But here, on the island, I was alone. And the truth about who I really was began to reveal itself. That successful millionaire, that man everyone admired, was nothing more than a facade. Now, without my money, without my possessions, who was I? This question tormented me. I always believed that my value was in the things I achieved, in my empire, in my success. But here, where none of those values mattered, I was just a vulnerable, weak, broken man. It was the first time in my life that I had come face to face with my own failures. And the worst part? There was no one to blame, no one to share this responsibility. Everything fell on me. Hunger was still my constant companion. With nothing to eat, my body began to eat itself. I felt my ribs bulge under my skin, my muscles wither. His stomach growled in an almost animalistic way, as if he were screaming for help. Each step he took was slower than the last, each breath heavier. Life seemed to be slowly slipping away from me, like sand slipping through my fingers. There were times when I thought about giving up, lay down on the sand, close my eyes, and let the ocean take me. The idea of ending the pain seemed tempting. After all, who would rescue me? Who would even know I was here? My partners and my team should already be taking control of the companies. Life went on without me. The world moved on, and I was stuck on this piece of land, alone with my pain and ghosts. On one of the darkest nights I've ever experienced, I decided to end it all. I left the cave barefoot and started walking towards the ocean. The moon illuminated the path, and the waves gently broke against the beach as if calling me. I reached the water's edge with the waves lapping at my feet and looked at the infinite sea in front of me. Everything seemed so easy at that moment. I just had to get into the water and let it carry me. There would be no more pain, no more despair. I stood there for a long time, looking at the horizon, feeling the weight of the decision. The tide was rising slowly, and the waves were crashing higher, but I still hesitated. Maybe it was survival instinct, or maybe it was a last spark of hope I didn't know I still had. I remembered moments in my life, little details that seemed insignificant at the time. A stranger's smile, a random conversation, a sunset I had never truly appreciated. Those little memories of a life that seemed so far away now. Suddenly, the sight of a shadow in the sand beside me stopped me in my tracks. I looked at the ground and saw something that, at first glance, appeared to be a piece of driftwood. I crouched down, and when I picked up the object, I realized it was a box. It was one of the boxes that were on the plane, lost among the wreckage that I had never found until then. My heart raced. Maybe it was just a piece of trash washed up by the waves, but at that moment, it represented something bigger. It was a sign, something I could use, a possibility, however small, of survival. I carried the box to the cave with a new sense of urgency. Maybe there was something inside her that could help me. I opened it with difficulty, using a rock to break the seal, and my eyes widened when I saw the contents. It wasn't exactly food or water, but what I found gave me a spark of hope. Inside, there were ropes, some tools, and pieces of plastic. It might not seem like much, but for me at that moment it was like having the world in my hands. Maybe, just maybe, I could use that to build something, to try to save myself. The decision I almost made at the seashore now seemed distant. For the first time in days, I felt a small strength building inside me. I was still alive, and as long as he was alive, there was a chance. No matter how small it was, I would grab this chance with everything I had left in me. Now my focus was on a single goal: to use everything I could find to survive, to fight to the end. With the box open in front of me, my eyes searched every piece of rope, every rusty tool, and every piece of plastic as if they were precious relics. To anyone else, it might just be scrap metal. But for me, at that moment, it was the hope I needed. My fingers shook as I touched each object. The hunger, pain, and exhaustion were still present, but something inside me had changed. Now, I had a mission. I was no longer adrift, waiting for death to take me. I was ready to fight, to try to survive, even if it was the last act of my life. I knew that what I had found in the box wasn't enough to save me completely, but it would be the first step. The first of many I would have to give. Those tools would be the basis for something bigger. I could use the ropes and plastic to create a better fishing net or shelter. Ideas started flowing into my head, and for a moment, I felt a glimpse of the person I once was. The man who solved problems, who found solutions. Only now, it wasn't about millions of dollars or contracts. It was a fight for life. The first thing I did was work at the shelter. The cave had protected me from the rain and winds, but I knew I needed something safer. I took the ropes and improvised a cover with the pieces of plastic and wood I could find on the beach. It took me hours to ride, each movement slower than the last, my body weak and my muscles protesting with each pull of the rope. But in the end, I achieved something that at least gave me a sense of security. The shelter was crude, precarious, but it was mine. There, I was protected. After days at the mercy of the island, this small victory was enough to rekindle a fire within me. The next step would be to find a way to feed myself. Hunting was impossible with my bare hands and without proper tools. I tried to build a spear out of a sturdy branch and one of the sharp tools I found in the box. My skills were limited, and once again I was faced with the fact that I had never learned how to do basic survival things. I always had everything ready, delivered on a platter. Now it was just me and my clumsy efforts. After many attempts, I managed to improvise a kind of trap for small fish. I used the ropes to tie pieces of wood to a circular structure and placed it in one of the shallowest areas of the ocean, where the smaller fish used to swim. I waited patiently, observing the transparent waters and hoping that my precarious invention would yield some results. For days, the trap remained empty. The despair began to return slowly. Every time he checked the trap and found nothing, he felt a tightness in his chest. I was trying hard, but it felt like the island was determined to break me, physically and mentally. The scorching sun burned my skin, and the lack of food was eating away at my strength. I knew I couldn't go on like this much longer. My body was wasting away quickly, and if I didn't find food soon, all my effort would be futile. It was on one of these days of frustration that the unexpected happened. As I walked along the beach, watching the waves, I saw something moving in the corner of my eye. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch my attention. I approached carefully and, to my surprise, found a sea turtle trapped in one of my makeshift nets, which had been dragged to the beach by the waves. The sight of that animal made me stop for a moment. The turtle struggled to free itself, moving its legs slowly and heavily. I knew what I needed to do. That animal would be my meal, my salvation. But at the same time, something inside me hesitated. He was desperate for food, but he had never killed an animal before. The man I was, the businessman, would never get dirty with something like that. However, there, on that deserted island, with death approaching every day, I had no choice. My hand shook as I held the rock I would use to kill the turtle. The animal looked at me with its deep, calm eyes, and for a second I felt a connection with it, as if we somehow shared the same fate of isolation. But at that moment, my need for survival spoke louder. I closed my eyes and hit hard. The dry sound of the stone hitting the carapace echoed in my mind, but I didn't stop. I continued until the animal was still. When it was all over, I felt empty, but at the same time relieved. I had food. For the first time in days, I would have something to feed my weakened body. With the turtle's body in my hands, I returned to the shelter and prepared to cook the meat. It took me hours to get a fire going. I used some dry stones and sticks that I had collected, rubbing them tirelessly until finally a small flame appeared. The heat was comforting, and the smell of the meat starting to cook made me realize how hungry I was. I didn't wait for it to be completely ready. When the first part was minimally cooked, I ate it voraciously. Every bite felt like the best feast I have ever tasted in my entire life. That day marked a turning point. The food gave me strength to continue, and the fire brought a little comfort for the night that followed. The fight wasn't over, but now I had something I hadn't had before, the feeling that perhaps I could survive. Maybe I could beat the island. But the question that continued to echo in my mind was, for how long? How long would my luck last before the island, or my own mind, knocked me down for good? The days dragged by slowly, like an invisible current that pulled me to the bottom. The turtle had given me strength, but as time passed, the food ran out. The tides continued to sweep the beach, sometimes bringing debris that could be useful, sometimes nothing but sand and silence. The fire, which I had fought so hard to keep burning, was starting to go out faster than I could rekindle it. And with it, darkness took over not only my physical world, but my mind. I found myself walking along the beach, looking at the horizon, as if the answer was in the waves, in the clouds, somewhere far away. The voices had gotten weaker, but now there was something worse. Total silence. A screaming void filled my thoughts, and it was in this void that I began to realize a truth that, until then, I had avoided facing. I was alone. But this loneliness wasn't just physical. It wasn't just the fact that he was lost on an island. It was much deeper. Reality hit hard when, on one of those walks along the beach, I started thinking about who would miss me. Who would be looking for me? The answer came cold and sharp. Almost no one. The business world has always been merciless. I knew that. He had built a fortune by stepping on people, beating the competition, making difficult decisions. I had thousands of employees under my command, but none of them knew who I really was. To them, I was just a distant figure, a boss they rarely interacted with. I always preferred to keep things that way. Personal life was a distraction, and I believed that true friendships and relationships only weakened them. I kept everyone at a distance. My hands grabbed a stick I had found in the sand, and I threw it hard into the waves, as if that piece of wood could take my frustration away. The sea returned it within seconds, as if saying there was no escaping the truth. Then came the inevitable question: who would care if I didn't come back? I had business partners, colleagues who depended on my decisions and investments. But friends? No. There was no one I could call a friend. The encounters I had in the social world were transactions, pure and simple. Expensive dinners, gala events, all a facade to maintain status. When the lights went out, I would go back to my luxurious apartment, alone. Always alone. And the family? I had left that behind a long time ago. My parents had left early, and I hadn't bothered to build something I could call a family. There was no one to call in difficult times, no one to share in victory or comfort in defeat. I prided myself on being independent, self-sufficient. But now, seeing things clearly, I realized how fragile that independence really was. Everything he had built, all the success and fortune, meant nothing here. On the island, the millionaire and the beggar were on the same level. I sat on the sand, looking out at the vast, indifferent sea. I realized that even before arriving on this island, I was already isolated. I always have been. There were no real bonds, no genuine affection. The people around me were there for what I could offer, what I represented. I knew that, but I preferred to pretend I didn't. I preferred to believe that I was in control, that being distant made me strong. Now the truth was inescapable. In my past life, isolation was a choice, an armor I wore for years, protecting me from bonds I considered weak or unnecessary. Here, however, this solitude was a prison, and worst of all, it was a prison that I had built myself. The wind was blowing hard that afternoon, and I found myself reflecting on everything I had left behind. The opportunities to love, to connect, to form something beyond contracts and business. I looked at the horizon, and for a moment, I wished I was back, but not in the world of millionaires and the elite. I wanted to be with someone who truly cared, someone who could hold me while the world fell apart around me. But there was no one. There never was. Night arrived, and with it, the biting cold of loneliness. The fire barely illuminated the shelter I had built, now dimmer than ever. The turtle had already been consumed, and the hunger was beginning to return. My body, still thin and injured, struggled to stay active, but my mind was collapsing. The island was an expanded reflection of my previous life. A vast, desolate place, without ties, without connections. Just survival, day after day, meaningless. Lying on the hard sand, I began to wonder if this was the end. What if no one came? What if I died here with no one to remember me? A millionaire, a man who built an empire, but who would ultimately die like a ghost, without leaving a trace. Perhaps it was an appropriate destination. Perhaps the island was showing me who I really was. An empty man, surrounded by useless riches. As my eyes felt heavy with exhaustion, a lone tear ran down my face. The first in years. I didn't cry. I never let my emotions dominate me. But that night, I cried for myself, for the man I became, for the man I never was. I cried for the wasted life, for the lost opportunities. And I cried because I was so alone, not just now, but all my life. Sleep came, but it was not restorative. I dreamed of faces I could barely recognize. They were the faces of people I left behind, people who might have tried to get closer, but whom I pushed away. And when I woke up, reality came back with a vengeance. I was alone. I always have been. And perhaps it always would be. The days blended together, becoming longer and more indistinct. The constant sound of the waves, which once seemed so threatening, was now part of the monotony that enveloped my life. Hunger had become a constant companion, a pain that I could no longer ignore, but that had somehow become part of me. Isolation, on the other hand, was no longer just physical. It was existential, an island in my own mind. However, something had changed after that night when I cried for the first time in years. The island had shown me the truth. I had always been alone, even surrounded by wealth and power. But now, I was beginning to question whether this fate of loneliness was truly inevitable. Was it possible that I could change? That this suffering had some purpose other than destroying me? These questions started to echo in my mind more frequently. I have always been practical. I have always seen the world in terms of results and objectives. So maybe there was something I could learn here. Maybe this island was my last chance at redemption, an opportunity to rebuild not just my life, but also my own character. Survival was no longer just physical. Now, I had to survive myself, to my own choices, to the man I had become. It was then that I realized that I could no longer wallow in hopelessness. If I could get off that island, I would have a second chance. And if I couldn't, at least I would die knowing that I tried to transform myself. With this new perspective, something began to change within me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a real desire to live. Not just to survive another day, but to actually live. And it started with a simple decision. I wouldn't give up on myself. My days now had a purpose, however small. The first step was to try to improve my physical situation. The hunger was still relentless, but I began to organize myself better. I used the tools I had found to improve my fishing traps. It took me days, But I finally managed to catch a few more fish. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going, to rekindle the flame of hope within me. The nights were the hardest. It was when the loneliness became heavier and the demons in my mind came to the surface. But now, instead of running away from them, I started facing them. I forced myself to think about the people I had left behind, the connections I never made. I remembered names, faces, moments that I previously considered irrelevant. And I realized that even in the midst of all the luxury, there were little glimmers of humanity in my life, moments that I never appreciated. Now I understood how much they meant. I spent hours thinking about these memories, wondering what it would be like if I had made different choices. And for the first time, I felt like there was something beyond money and success. Something I had ignored for so long. The human need to connect, to be part of something bigger than oneself. I had spent so much time trying to conquer the world that I never realized I was moving away from everything that really mattered. I started thinking about what my life would be like if I left that island. What would I do differently? Who would I connect with? Who would I try to win back? There were people, even if few, with whom I could still make peace. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe if I could survive this, I could rebuild my life in ways I never imagined. This small hope, this idea of redemption, began to move me in ways that nothing else had moved before. Every day I got up with a goal, even if small, to survive, yes, but also to plan my future. Because now, for the first time in a long time, I wanted to have a future. I wanted to be a better man. With each new dawn, I forced myself to do something to keep myself busy. If it wasn't hunting or fishing, it would be improving shelter. If it weren't for that, it would be thinking of ways to signal potential rescuers. My body was still weak, but my mind was starting to get stronger again. And with that, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was on one of those days of introspection while walking along the beach that I noticed something different. On the horizon, far in the distance, I saw a small dot, something that seemed to be moving slowly over the water. My eyes widened, my heart raced. Could it be a boat? A ship? I ran as fast as my weakened body would allow me to the highest point on the island. I grabbed a piece of wood, tied it with the piece of plastic I had found, and started shaking it as loud as I could. My heart was beating like it was going to explode, hope growing inside me like an uncontrollable flame. The dot on the horizon kept moving, but it didn't seem to get any closer. I screamed, even though I knew it was useless. The sound of my voice mixed with the wind, but I continued, desperately, shaking the piece of wood with all my strength. What seemed like an eternity passed, and finally the dot began to disappear, swallowed by the horizon. Desperation almost consumed me at that moment. The chance of rescue, which had shone for a moment, had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I let myself fall on the sand, powerless, trying to control the tears, but something inside me refused to give up. I had already come so far. I couldn't let that setback destroy my new will to live. I stood up slowly, my muscles aching and my heart heavy. But I knew I was no longer alone, even if I physically was. Now, there was a flame inside me, a desire to rebuild not only my life, but myself. And somehow, I knew that if I kept fighting, my chance at redemption would come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but she would come, and I would be ready. The weeks dragged by, but something inside me had changed. Despite the difficulties, despite the cold nights and the hunger that still tormented me, I refused to give up. It was no longer just a matter of surviving, but of proving to myself that I could be more than the selfish man who had lost himself in a life of luxury and solitude. The island, which had once been my prison, now felt like a battlefield where I fought to become someone different, someone better. And then, on a morning like any other, something happened. I was sitting on the sand, watching the sun rise above the horizon, when I felt a strange vibration in the air. It was a distant sound, almost imperceptible, but it made my heart race. I stood up suddenly, trying to focus my attention. It wasn't the sound of wind or waves. It was something different, something mechanical. A noise I hadn't heard in so long that it seemed unreal. I ran to the highest point on the island, my body still weak from hunger and exertion, but my spirit was stronger than ever. I climbed with difficulty, slipping on the rocks until I reached the top. And then I saw it, a helicopter. He was far away, but he was definitely coming towards me. The propellers cut through the air and the sound grew louder as it got closer. My heart almost stopped with so much emotion. I screamed with all the strength I had left. I waved my arms desperately, as if the helicopter could see me just by the force of my will. I ran back to my makeshift shelter, grabbing everything I had. The piece of plastic tied to the branch, the ashes from the fire I had kept burning. I lit what was left of my fire with the last smoldering ember, hoping the helicopter would see the smoke. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. The noise of the propellers was closer, but the helicopter did not reduce its altitude. It was now or never. With the strength of a desperation that only a man on the verge of the end knows, I ran back to the beach, holding the makeshift branch like a distress flag. The helicopter blades were already making the air shake around me. He was flying low, but still there was no sign that he had seen me. My mind began to fill with doubts. What if it happened to me? What if the pilot didn't see the smoke, or worse, saw me and continued on his way? For an instant, the terror of staying forever on that island washed over me like a wave of despair. The last chance I might have was there, and I could do nothing but wait and hope to be seen. Then suddenly, the helicopter began to turn. My heart stopped. The propellers slowed down, and the noise got closer until the helicopter hovered over the beach. My legs gave way and I sank to the sand, tears streaming freely down my face. I had been seen. After everything, after weeks of isolation and near death, someone had finally found me. The helicopter landed on the beach with a crash, kicking up a cloud of sand and wind. The deafening noise of the propellers enveloped me, but now it seemed to be the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Inside, I saw the doors open, and men came out quickly in uniforms and helmets, advancing towards me. I tried to get up, but my body was exhausted. My mind was still processing what was happening. Were they real voices? Real people? After so long without hearing a human voice, those sounds seemed to echo from another world. My words came out faint, barely audible as I reached out my hand. I'm here. I tried to scream, but my voice broke into a whisper. One of the men, a paramedic, came over and helped me to my feet. He spoke to me, but the words were mixed with the noise of the propellers, and I could only nod my head, grateful. They carried me to the helicopter, supporting me as my legs gave out. When I got in, I collapsed into my seat, still dazed. The helicopter took off, and for the first time in weeks, I found myself leaving the island behind. The sight of those trees and the waves below me, which had once seemed so threatening, was now just a blur of bitter memories. A sense of relief and redemption washed over me, but something deeper was happening inside me. As the helicopter soared through the sky, I realized that my physical survival wasn't the only thing that mattered. I had changed. That island, which almost destroyed me, also gave me a second chance. A chance to rebuild not just my life, but myself. As the helicopter continued its course over the ocean, my mind wandered to what came next. What would you do when you returned? There were so many things I never thought to value. The feeling of safety, another person's voice, the warmth of a human connection. I realized that before being rescued, I was lost not only on the island, but in life. Now I saw what really mattered. It would be difficult. I knew the path back to the real world wouldn't be easy. He had a lifetime of mistakes to fix, bridges to rebuild. But now, with this new purpose, I felt that anything was possible. The island had shown me the worst of myself, and at the same time, it had given me the opportunity to be better. As the helicopter moved forward, I felt the last tear run down my face, but this time, it wasn't one of despair. It was hope. Hope that I could finally be the person I always should have been. I survived. And now, I would live. As the helicopter carried me back to the world I had left behind, a world that now seemed so distant and unrecognizable, I allowed myself to close my eyes for a moment. The propellers whizzing above me were a reminder that I was finally safe. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real journey was just beginning. The island had shaped me in ways I could never have imagined. At first, it was just a place of despair, a prison from which I saw no escape. I fought against it, against hunger, against loneliness, against the fear that slowly consumed me. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized that my biggest battle was not with the island itself, but with myself. I was my own worst enemy. Early in my life, I believed that success and power would protect me from everything. I thought that by accumulating wealth, I could avoid the pains of ordinary life. I kept my distance from people, built invisible walls around myself, and in the end, even surrounded by money, I discovered that I was more alone than ever. The island's isolation was just the final reflection of an already lonely life. When I found myself trapped there, I had to confront everything I had always avoided. The truth about who I was, the emptiness inside me, and the choices that brought me to that point. And it was in this confrontation that I began to change. The island was not just a place of physical survival, but the scene of an internal transformation. I had been reborn there. Now, with the ocean stretching out below me, I realized that the real rescue hadn't begun with the helicopter's arrival. It began when I understood that to survive, I needed to connect with something bigger than my own ego, something beyond my possessions and status. I needed to lose everything to finally understand the value of what really matters. I would return to the world, but I would not return as the same man who arrived on that island. I was ready to rebuild my life, to heal the wounds I had caused myself. It wouldn't be easy, I knew that. There would be many bridges to be rebuilt, many difficult conversations to be had, but for once I was willing to try. I was willing to be vulnerable, admit my mistakes, and seek a new path. The helicopter eventually landed in a makeshift field at a small rescue base. I was greeted by a medical team, people who helped me get off the aircraft, asking about my health status. My mind was elsewhere. I looked up at the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun in a different way, and realized that, for the first time in a long time, I felt grateful to be alive. As they took me to a triage tent, I couldn't stop thinking about what would come next. I had survived, but now came the hardest part. Truly living. Not on autopilot like before, but fully, connected with the world and the people around me. The island gave me a second chance, and I didn't intend to waste it. Life is unpredictable. We never know what might happen, and we often take what we have for granted. It wasn't just the island that showed me this. It was the absence of everything I considered important that made me see the truth. In the end, it is not possessions, nor success, nor money that define who we are. It's the connections we make, the relationships we cultivate, and the way we face our fears and vulnerabilities. Now, with a new life ahead of me, I knew I was ready to face anything. What I learned in those endless days of struggle was that all of us, regardless of who we are or what we have, are capable of reinventing ourselves, of changing, of seeking redemption. Survival is not just about keeping breathing. It's about finding new purpose, even in the most difficult circumstances. The island taught me that as long as there is life, there is hope. And with this hope, we can transform ourselves, reconnect with what really matters, and finally, live fully. The story of my rescue wasn't just about surviving a desert island. It was about surviving myself, the life I had built, and the person I had become along the way. Each of us faces invisible battles, some bigger than others, but all important. If there's anything I've learned on this journey, it's that it's never too late to change. It's never too late to seek redemption. Description for the video. This millionaire had everything: money, power, and a life of luxury. But after a plane crash, he was stranded on a desert island, fighting to survive. Over time, he realizes that his biggest battle was not against nature, but against himself. Without family, without friends, he had to face his loneliness and rediscover the true meaning of life. This is a journey of transformation and hope. Don't miss this moving story of overcoming and redemption. Did you like the story? Subscribe to the channel and leave your comment. We are always ready to improve and bring you even more inspiring stories. Overcoming survival. Transformation. Inspiring stories. Castaway. Rescue. Life journey.